Hey all, good morning. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, sir.
Right. Yeah, we'll wait for 5 minutes, then we'll start. Okay. Yeah. Good morning, all. Shall we start? I think most of you joined. Avinash, Gayatri, Mohit, Pradeep, Sahiti, Sunawar, Venkat, Thomas. Again, Venkat. Okay. So if you're all able to hear and if you're all able to see, we will start. Okay. You guys able to see my screen as well, right?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Great. So once again, just a minute, we'll quickly revise this. Okay. So From our Spring content, what we understand is we can able to implement web applications using Spring framework, using Spring MVC particularly. We can able to implement a web application by using all other modules as well. So once we're done with this web application, we would able to convert it into where, and we can deploy it into any external servers like Tomcat, WebLogic, JBoss, any container we can use to run. Yeah. And using Spring Boot also we can able to do this. But when it comes to Spring Boot, your application you need not to convert into where and deploy it into Tomcat. In case if you want, you can do that. Or else Spring Boot. Yeah, Avinash, your audio is not connected that I can see. Can you please rejoin again? Okay, you can't hear that. Okay, let him rejoin. Yeah. So when we implement the same thing in Spring Boot, we need not to convert into var file. In case if you want, you can do that. Particularly if you want to deploy it into external web servers. Otherwise, you can able to deploy this as jar or run it as a jar directly. Okay. Spring Boot application, you can run it as jar, as Spring Boot itself is having its own embedded containers like Tomcat, Jetty, Undertow. So we can use embedded Tomcat container to run application, so that you need not to convert into var and deploy it into additional servers. You can use the inbuilt servers to run your Spring Boot application. And the same Spring Boot application, we can break it into multiple microservices and we can manage them as a separate application. So that is also we can able to do using Spring Boot. We can able to implement microservices. Okay. So if we implement it through microservices, the benefit is as we discussed, right? We can parallelly develop multiple modules and we can able to have good performance and modularity. Many things we can able to achieve when you build it into microservices. So the main aim is application performance and the maintenance would be easy if you go with microservices. So when you want to add new product or new module to your application, you just need to implement a separate module and deploy it. You need not to use the existing application code. You need not to edit your code and do the modifications there. Instead, you can able to build new application when you want to add new module, and you can add that new module or you can deploy that new module into new environment and you can integrate that in your API gateway. So from there onwards, your new UI able to access it. Anyways, microservices are advanced than normal applications. Okay, we can able to build applications separately and we can able to manage them when we go with microservices. Okay, we need to start with Spring framework. That too, in Spring framework we have Spring core module. So we have to start with Spring core module first. So when it comes to Spring core module, we have to understand first. Okay, we have to understand first, Spring core is having its own self containers. So we need to understand how to use the self containers. How to use Spring containers we have to understand first, because when you build a Spring application or Spring Boot application, when you build Spring Boot application or Spring application or microservices based application, we follow this pattern. We follow this pattern, MVC pattern we follow. So as per MVC pattern, we will have separate front end and separate back end. As part of back end, we implement our Java code here, controllers, service classes, DAOs. Particularly, controllers will do this read and validate operations. Under service, we write business code, and under DAO, we made CRUD operations here. And the modules which we use from Spring for implementing controllers are Spring MVC, Spring Security, and for service AOP, transactions, and for coming to DAO we use JDBC, ORM, and finally once you implemented your MVC classes, okay, where you are going to run all these classes means you are going to run all these classes on Spring Core only. Okay, on Spring Core we have containers. Using that containers only we are going to run all our classes. Okay, we are going to run all our classes on Spring Core given containers only. So first we should understand how to use that containers, okay. So today's topic, how to use Spring containers, how to use Spring containers to run our classes. Okay, so there are two types of containers. One is core container and one is J2EE container. There are two containers. One is core container and the one is J2EE container. There are two containers given. There are two containers, core container and J2EE container. We mostly use J2EE container because it has all the features. Core container doesn't have. Okay. So basically, what is the responsibility? The main responsibility of this containers is I implemented an application. I implemented application in Spring. So as I said, right, I followed this MVC pattern. Here I have some views. Here I have some views, means HTML pages. And from HTML pages, when I submit my form request to read that data, I implemented a controller. I implemented a controller here, and controller will do controller operations. Once controller done with read operation and validation operations, for executing business logic, controller will send data to business class. Business class will send data to DAO for doing CRUD operations. Okay, we consider these are our application classes, controller, business, service. Okay, so when we get the request from view, controller will read that. Controller will forward the same data to business for doing business operations. Once done with that business operations, it will send it to DAO. So DAO will finally will do CRUD operations on your database. It will finally do all database operations on DB. So this is how the general flow is. Okay. Now these are my MVC classes that I implemented. Okay. The first rule when you are using Spring, right? When we are using Spring framework, the first rule is the first rule is while implementing your classes, right? All your classes should be poses. Okay, all classes should be poso classes. Hello, hello, hello. Am I audible to everyone? Hello.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
So from where it is dropped, did you follow till here?
Not here, just before 1 minute before.
Okay. So what I was saying is how to use containers, right? How to use containers. So when I implement a particularly application using Spring or any Java framework, right? I generally follow this architecture pattern. I create views, and views data I submit first to controllers. Controller data I submit to business, and business data to DAO. Finally, DAO will store data on databases. Okay. So when it is particularly Spring, what I'm saying is all classes should be POSO classes. Whatever controller or business or DAO you implement, right? All that classes should be POSO classes. I'm saying all your classes should be POSO classes. Okay. So yes, controllers you can create it as a POSO, and business class as also POSO, and DAO also POSO. POSO means nothing but simple plain Java class. Okay. POSO stands for plain old Java object, plain old Java object, which means it is not depending on any framework. When you call plain old Java object, what it is, if you find a class without having any dependency of other framework, okay, just by using your core Java library, or else even if you use other libraries also, if your class is not extending or not implementing any other class, if it is not extending and if it is not implementing, if it extends some class, or if it implements some other class, we cannot call it as POSO class. Okay, we cannot call it as POSO class because it is having some other library dependency here. Okay, some other library dependency here. So these are not plain Java classes. Okay, so when we call a class as a plain Java class means if it doesn't have any dependency of other APIs, you are not extending any API and you are not implementing any API here. If you write a simple plain Java class, if you write a simple plain Java class with your required properties and required methods, with required properties and methods, if you implement a Java class, you can call it as plain Java class. Okay, so a plain Java class, if you implement, you can call it as POSO. Okay, you can call this as POSO. So what I'm saying is, first thing while implementing your controller classes or business or DAO classes should be POSOs in Spring. Okay, all classes should be POSOs. Simple plain Java classes we need to write. Simple plain Java classes we need to write. So we can call it as POSO class. We can call it as POSO class. And if your class extending or implementing from any other API means that is not a POSO. Okay, so you can call this one as a POSO. This is not POSO, and this one also not a POSO class, but this is the POSO class. This is the right format. If your class, if it have some properties and methods, and if your class not extending or not implementing any other API, you can call this as POSO class. Okay, so first thing is we need to create all our classes as POSO classes in Spring. Okay, we are talking about containers. Okay, the topic is how to use Spring containers. How to use Spring containers. How to use Spring containers. So when I implement all my classes as POSO class, when I implement all my classes as POSO class, I can use Spring containers. When I implement all my classes as POSO classes, I implemented controller POSO, business POSO, DAO POSO. Okay. So by following first statement, all classes should be POSO classes. So you need to create a POSO class first. Okay, you need to create a POSO class. Then all that POSO classes you need to configure. Okay, so once you implement with your controllers, business, DAO, you need to do Spring configuration first. Okay, so along with your application classes, as we are using Spring, right, I implemented all my POSO classes. Now you want to run application using Spring. As you want to run application using Spring, right, you need to do Spring configurations here. You need to do Spring configurations here. There is a Spring XML file. In that Spring XML file, you just need to configure your controller, business, DAO, POSO class here. There is a tag name called, we call it as bean. So using this bean tag, we configure all our classes here. Bean controller, here we configure our controller class, and here we configure our business class, and here we configure our DAO class. Controller, business, and DAO classes. Just by using bean tag, we configure them. Okay. So implement all your classes as Pozo classes and configure your each Pozo class into Spring XML file. Finally, you need to load this XML file configurations into IOC container. IOC is a Spring event container. Just you need to load this XML into IOC container. Just you need to load this into IOC container. Now when I start this IOC, as this is container, right? Here we have option to start. Just you need to start this container. Just you need to start this container. When you start this container, when you start this, it will read all your configurations. It will read all your Spring XML configurations. Under that configurations, we configured our controllers, business and DAO classes. So what it will do, container will start managing these objects. It will start managing these objects. So what it will manage, first it will create your controller class object and business class object, DAO class object. IOC will start creating objects first. Okay, it will create all your classes objects. It will create all your classes objects when you start your IOC container. Okay, so the first thing that what you need to remember is you need to implement your controllers, business and DAOs as a simple POJOs. As a simple POJOs you need to implement. Is it really enforced that Spring need to implement POJOs? Yes, most of the times, mostly, right? Your classes would be POJO classes. Your classes would be POJO classes. Nowhere it will ask you to extend or implement its libraries until unless it is Spring MVC or few design patterns. Otherwise, Spring will not enforce or Spring will not ask you to extend its classes. Spring will not ask you to extend its libraries for implementing your controllers, business, DAO classes. Okay, nowadays we have annotation based configurations. Okay, even your MVC also you need not to extend or implement from a Spring MVC library. Earlier we used to implement controller classes, but they give an annotation style. When you go with that, you need not to implement your class from their libraries. Okay, just plain Java classes would be enough to handle all these operations. Okay, that's why I'm telling you, you need to implement your classes as POJOs only. POJOs. Okay, controller all is a POJO, business also a POJO, DO also a simple POJO class. Just you need to configure your POJO classes into Spring XML file. Once you create your classes, you need to configure them into Spring XML file. Finally, we load this Spring XML into IOC container. When you start IOC container, it will start creating objects. It will start creating objects. So how to use Spring container means just create your POJO, configure your POJO into XML and load it into IOC. 3 steps. Create POJO class, configure POJO class and run IOC. Okay, we'll see how to do this. Okay, I'll give a example here. Let me create a Java project. Containers. How to use containers. How to use. So create a Java project and add library. If it is Maven, add library through Maven project, or else you can download our libraries and add your libraries into class path. Just create project, add libraries to class path. Now what next? So first thing you need to create a POJO class. Then you configure it into XML. So create a package, beans. I'm creating a POJO class here, a simple class. student poser class. Okay, I'm not doing anything, just overriding default constructor student object creating. Okay, so when you want to create student class object, generally how do you create? Student s equal to new student. This is how we create. Okay, when we ask to create student class object, this is how we create. But in Spring you need not to do that. Spring can create it. Okay, you need not to do this. Spring will do this. Spring will create object for you. Okay, you need not to create. So what you need to do is just you need to configure your bean class into XML. Okay, create a Spring XML file, spring.xml. So here we have basically the root tag is beans. So beans is the main root tag. Under this root tag we have a bean child tag. In this bean child tag we have mainly two properties. One is ID and one is class. So here you configure your bean ID and bean class. Bean ID means a unique identifier. Okay, unique identifier. You should not repeat this ID for another class. So for student, if you want to put ID, you can use any ID here. That should be unique. And your class name should be fully qualified path of your class. Fully qualified path. Okay, beans dot student. And here this is student ID. Okay, this is how you need to configure your Spring XML. Okay, so if you have 100 poso classes, all that 100 poso classes beans you need to configure here. Okay, so all your beans you need to configure here. Then you need to load this XML into container. So container is a simple Java class again. Container is a Java class only. Just you need to start that from main method. Okay, so you need to write a main method class. From main method only you can start it. From main method only you can start it. As I said, there are two containers. Okay, there are two containers. When it comes to IOC containers, there are two containers we have. One is bean factory container, which is core container. Bean factory, we call it as core container. And there is a J2EE container, name is application context, which is J2E container. Okay, we'll see how to use bean factory. First, while you want to use bean factory, you need to read this XML first. You need to read this XML first. So we use resource class to read it. Resource equal to new class path XML resource. So just okay. So first we need to read our XML first. Okay, first we need to read our XML first. Then we need to load it into bean factory. Read XML and load this into bean factory. Step 1, read resource equal to new class path resource. So using this class path, what you can do is from your application path itself, from your application path under resources, you will have multiple packages, right? So you can give that package name dot file, package name slash file name to read it from class path. Otherwise, you need to give the physical location of file so that you cannot able to run this in another environment. So we use always class path resource when we want to read files. It will read files from your class path only. We can give directly the class path location here to read our XML. So here our XML file name is spring.xml, which is there in resources folder. So this is the resources folder. From that folder I want to read spring XML. So give spring XML file here. Read it first. Then you need to load this. You need to load this into bean factory. You need to load it into bean factory. Bean factory is a core container. Bean factory is a core container. How it will behave. So as I'm saying here, I need to create a POSO class, then I need to configure it into XML file, and I need to load it into IOC container. So I did the same. I created a POSO class and I configured my POSO class into XML, and finally I'm loading it into IOC container. Let's try to run this. So I'm seeing errors here. What it is saying is XML bean definition store exception line 1 XML document from class path is invalid. It is saying XML parsing issue. SAX parser exception. Cannot find the declaration of beans. It is saying your tags are invalid. Your tags are invalid. Whatever tags I'm using here, it is saying invalid. So basically when we use XML, right, to validate your tags, to validate these tags, your XML should have, your XML here should have either DTD or XSD. DTD or XSD we must configure here. So using the DTD or XSD only, your tags will be validated. These tags will be validated by using DTD or XSD only. So first we need to configure the DTD here. DTD means doc type definition. Just a style for creating tag library. Okay. So these tags are created in this DTD only. In this DTD only, this tags definition they given. So in this DTD file, if you open all the tags definitions they have given in the DTD file only, so you can read that file. Okay, in this tags they mention these tags are there, and each tag is having some attributes like ID, class. Just so you need to configure DTD here. Without DTD, your tags will not be validated. So inside DTD only, your tags definitions has given. So how to create a tag and what attributes it have, everything is there inside this beans DTD file. So okay, I configure DTD and then try to run. Okay, now I'm not seeing any error here. So your IOC started properly. But as I said, IOC container is responsible to create all these objects, right? Controller, business, DO class objects, whatever you implement as a POSO, that class object it should create. Yes, it will create. But bean factory is a core container and is a lazy container until unless you call factory dot get bean method. factory.getBean of ID you need to pass. Until unless you do this call, it will not create any object. Factory.getBean of your bean class ID you should pass. When you pass your bean class ID, then it will start creating object. See, student object creating. So when we call getBean method, what it is doing, whatever bean here it configured, this bean class object it created, beans.student. So from this path, at runtime, Spring is reading your class and it is creating object. For this class, at runtime, it is creating object by calling this default constructor. That's why we are seeing this statement, student object creating. Who is doing that? Your bean factor. How many objects like that it will create throughout application? If I call this get bean for 100 times, will it create for 100 times? So I'm calling bean for 7 times here, but only one object created. Only one object created. So by default, your IOC container will create only one object only. All your beans are singletons. So consider here your application is having 100 classes. You configured 100 beans here in XML. And when we load this XML into IOC, how many objects it will create? So let's say million users are requesting 100 classes from web. Though million users are requesting, it will not create millions objects. It will create only 100 objects only. Whatever number of beans I configured here, the same number of objects only it will create for your application. Okay, so all your beans by default singletons, only one object will be created. Singleton means only one object throughout application. So that is the recommended also. Only one object only we create throughout application, not many. Okay, so this is how bean factory will behave. So the bean factory will not create object unless we call getBean method. If we don't call getBean method, no object. If you call getBean method, then it will create object. That too only first time. Only first time when you call getBean method only it will create object. From the next statement onwards, it will return you same object. So here it will create the object and it will return to you. And from next, whenever you call, it will not create a brand new object. Instead of it will return same object again and again, as your bean is singleton. In case if you don't want single object for multiple requests, if you want to make it prototype, here we have an attribute called scope. Here you can configure scope to prototype. Singleton means one object, prototype means multiple objects. For each call, it will create one brand new object. So I created 7 times. I called here 7 times. So it created object for 7 times. Student object is creating for 7 times. Okay. So this is how core container will behave. So when you don't mention anything prototype here, it will create only one object. That too, that first object it will create when you call getBean method only. Okay, when you call getBean method only, first object will be created. If it is prototype, for every getBean method it will create object. If it is prototype, for every getBean method it will create object. So by default scope is singleton. By default the scope is singleton. So you need not to configure. If you want singleton, by default the scope is singleton. Okay, if you want prototype, you can configure prototype here. Otherwise the bean scope is always singleton only. Okay, so now we will see J2EE container application class, one more class, J2E application. Application context ap equal to new class path XML application context. So here also you can load your XML file, resources slash spring dot XML. Okay, so directly you can load XML here, directly you can load it into application context. This is J2E container, this is J2E container. Directly you can load XML into your J2E container, and when you run J2W container, what will happen? During loading time only it will create object. It will not wait until you call getBean method. It will create object when you load it itself. When you load this itself here, it will create object. It will not wait for getBean method to create your object. It will not wait for getBean method. Instead, right, while loading your XML itself, application context will create object. Okay, application context will create object. These are the two containers. These are the two containers that we have: bean factory and one is application context. We mostly go with this application context as we have all the features here. So when we use this, it is not having most of the features. And when we implement a complete application, right, we are not going to see this class or this class. You need not to configure IOC class. IOC class is inbuiltly configured in MVC, so that inbuilt IOC classes will be executed. Only for understanding core example and other modules, we go with this. Otherwise, in Spring MVC, even you need not to configure it. Okay, so we'll discuss more in detail about it. Okay, so this is how we use IOC containers to get our objects. Okay, so any doubt so far?
Sir, in that XML file, that first two lines, what is it? Can you explain the XML file?
This one,
Yeah, first two lines.
yeah. So
It's commented,
basically,
right, sir? The first.
no, not commented. This is how we configure DTD or schema. Okay, every XML file must have a DTD or schema. Okay, as a mandatory, you need to configure it here. Why? Because you are using tags here, right? So while using this tags, you need to use only the tags Spring given tags. If you try to put your own custom tag, if you try to put something here, my hero, something, some tag you put here, as with your naming conventions. When you do this, what will happen? Your XML file will be validated against this DTD tags. Under this DTD file, what are all tags that you can able to use here? They mentioned it. Okay, what are all tags that you can use? What are all attributes that you can use? Everything they mentioned in this DTD. So by following this DTD, you need to use these tags. You should not create your own tags here, and you should not misplace your tags also. So your tags always will be validated against this DTD file. Okay,
Okay,
to validate your
okay. Sir, and
tags. Yeah,
that line is not closed also. That tag is not closed. That DTT file tag,
no,
close tag.
this is not particularly XML tag. This is the schema configuration. This is not a tag. Okay,
Oh,
this is simple expression to
okay,
configure DTD. So you don't worry about it.
okay,
This is how we configure it. Okay. So from here, actually tags will start. So this is the main root tag, and under that root tag, the main child tag is bean. So bean here, I am doing self-ending. I closed it with self-ending. So you can use self-ending or else ending tag. If you don't have any properties between bean and bean tag, you better do self-ending here instead of using again a ending tag. Okay, both are same. So tomorrow we discuss more in detail about this IOC containers, how these IOC containers will create object and where they will manage this object. We will discuss about that context. Okay, that is very important. I'll try to make you understand how it will maintain that context. As I said, there are multiple scopes, right? Singleton, prototype. We discussed very in detailed about that. Why it need to create that context and where it will manage these objects. Okay, so if you're not registered, please register as soon as possible as this link expires, right? So you please register before this link expires itself. Okay, so I'm sharing my contact also. If you have any doubts, you can call me anytime. I shared my mobile number also while doing payments or anything, or if you didn't get any link also, you can call me or text me on this mobile number. Okay, mostly by tomorrow you would be getting, already if you paid, you would be getting regular link. Okay, so there our sessions will start. Okay guys.
I'm audible, sir.
Yeah, I
Sir,
can
are
hear
you
you.
going to share PPT or theory notes with them?
Yeah, good question. If you are first today, I'll tell you what are all the things that we are going to share. Already we have our own
Yes,
blog
sir.
we maintain for our session. Okay, so all things will be available in our blog itself. Okay, this is our blog. I regularly used to update this. Okay, so here you will get all my examples, jar files, materials, everything I'll attach here. So even as an add-on, we discuss Hibernate also. Hibernate examples, Hibernate jars, everything are available there. I'll send you PPTs or the PDFs which all I have.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, good morning, sir. Sir, I'm joining. Actually, I'm in the other session. Yeah, I'm trying to wrap that up. Please stay there. Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, I'll share this link, everything. Okay. So, any doubts? Hello, am I audible? Hello, 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 hello. Am I audible? Hello, hello.
Yes, sir. How to get recording of these classes and
Recordings
previous
you will get.
classes?
Recordings you will get. Just you will share your mail IDs, right? Once done with your payment, you will get regular videos through Google Drive. So you will get a Google Drive link in your mail. Okay, shared folder. They'll share it with you. Shared folder. This is how you will get. Okay, a shared folder you get. You will see all the recordings there.
Okay, sir.
Okay, you will get all the recordings. Your session recordings only you will get from day one to last session.
Okay.
So you'll be getting examples and these class notes and the blog URL for getting your examples and downloads, everything. So everything is accessible to you. Okay, you need not to worry, and you can reach out to me anytime. Yeah, I'll share the link once I get the confirmation email IDs, right?
Okay, sir.
I will share the link with everyone. I'll share the links. I'll share the even this drawings also. Everything I'll share. Okay, need not to worry. So yeah, that's all for today. We'll connect sharp 7 a.m. tomorrow, and the session will be after this demo completion, right? Tomorrow, the session will go for 1.5 hour session, 7 to 8:30, like that. Okay, we can change the time once everybody joins, right?
Sir,
Based
and
on
what,
the convention. Yeah, go ahead.
so what about spring core jars, sir? Today we added two spring core jars. Can
Okay.
you please send that also?
Yeah, yeah. So please share all your email IDs to my number. Okay, I shared you my number, right? Please copy my number and text me your email IDs. I'll share. Will that be fine?
Yeah, okay, sir.
Yeah. So yeah, that's all, guys. I need to drop. We'll connect sharp 7 a.m. tomorrow. Okay. Till then, good day. Bye. Okay. Get the confirmation link by tomorrow, so that we'll join in regular link one. Yeah. Thanks all.